How you doing? Today we're going to be taking a look at HoloAudio Cyan 2, a banger of a DAC that had me so curious I reached out to Tim over at KitsuneHiFi to send me one, and he did. So this is my first look at anything from HoloAudio, and I got a lot of questions. So let's see what secrets we can unlock inside this new black and orange box and exploit its riches. Full disclosure, this isn't a sponsored video and all opinions are just mine. While the Cyan 2 was sent to me, I don't get to keep it once I'm finished with the review. Now that that's out of the way, the HoloAudio Cyan 2 is an R2R ladder DAC, and there are three main things setting it apart from other DA converters. So the first one is it's a true NOS DAC. Now NOS stands for non-oversampling, and this is kind of a big deal. All DACs I've experienced up to this point were OS, or oversampling. Sure, many of them have non-oversampling options, but they aren't actually true NOS per se. Instead, they try and copy the way NOS works with linear oversampling. But it's not the same thing. In most cases, I found it either didn't make much of a difference at all, or I just ended up preferring oversampling on those DACs. So what's the difference, you might ask? I'm not going to get too technical in this review, but I'll link an article on NOS versus OS if you're interested in learning more. One thing to keep in mind about true NOS DACs, though, is their time domain is literally perfect. This is not necessarily the case on OS DACs, which may result in artifacts. Click on the link below the like button to read more, but I'd honestly recommend you trying one of these DACs out yourself and seeing if it's something that you may prefer. Now, the minimalist in you may end up preferring the Cyan's very bare bones approach to delivering your audio. It has no buttons or remote. You simply plug it in, connect it, and the Cyan just does its thing. Input switching is also done internally, and we'll get more into that in a bit. Now, because of all this bare bonesness, you get number 3, which is its aggressive price relative to its sound quality. The Cyan 2 will set you back a very reasonable $1,198 US. And as you're about to find out, this DAC punches way above that price.
Hadouken! Hadouken!
With that, let's get into my trip.
After I unboxed it, I plugged it into my H190 and Weem Pro, then started Roon Radio. The Cyan immediately knew which input was active as music began to play. The bitrate displayed next to the corresponding white lights, and I verified them changing properly with each track. Now, I initially noticed some hot treble, but I guess this is to be expected since Holo recommends a half hour of warm-up, and the DAC was still cold, to be honest, from the delivery truck. So I kept it going while I went out in a snowstorm to pick up my kids from school. 2 hours of gridlock, people not knowing how to drive, and some of them getting stuck with their summer tires spinning and going absolutely nowhere. I finally get home and hear what seems to be a much smoother sound. While not familiar with the orchestral music chosen via Roon Radio, I definitely liked what I was hearing. I very much enjoyed As Ballad. The harp was so well defined and fast. I don't know much about harpists, but this woman had me picturing a sort of orchestral Jimi Hendrix vibe, and she just seemed incredibly talented. I wanted to see the bit rate of the track and glanced over to the Cyan and just basically saw 3 white lights. There was no way I could tell without walking up to the thing. I measured and I need approximately 4.5 feet or less of a distance to read the little white print, and that's with my glasses on. It's fine though. Roon shows me the bitrate when I click on the right spot. So this track came on and imaging was pretty great. The lead vocalist sounded as if he was in the front row center of my room, and the backup singers were crowded in the back. In between the lead and backup dudes were the fiddle and what sounded like bongos and tambourines. Yeah, this thing handles positioning really, really nicely. And now, I want to drink with Brian on his musical barge. This was really fun, and I ended up listening to it twice. And I was sober. Just saying. Since I didn't feel comfortable stacking a DAC that doesn't belong to me, I ordered a proper rack for my office. Now the Cyan 2 kept really good company while I assembled the thing. With the rack assembled and everything connected to the Cyan, I sat back in my lazy boy and started playing music once again.
So after that Van Morrison track finished, the next track was playing, but there was no sound coming out of my speakers. Thinking this was an error with the streamer, I tracked back in Roon, but I still had no sound. So I had a feeling at this point that I knew what the problem was. The optical that I had connected from my TV was just taking over the Cyan 2's input preference. To test this, I played a YouTube video, and yeah, Marquez is speaking through my audio system, and I don't necessarily want him to be. I just wanted to use that TV as a Roon display like I normally do when I'm listening to music. So to troubleshoot, I set the Mac Mini's audio output to its internal speakers, and I pressed play in Roon, and no, still no dice. I then turned off the TV completely, and after 10 seconds, the Cyan switched back to coax. Neil was now singing, and all was right with the world. I turned the TV back on, and Mr. Young was still searching for a heart of gold. And I'm getting old. So now that the TV turned back on, with the computer set to internal speakers, it was working, but who knows when the Cyan will arbitrarily decide to switch back to that optical input. Okay, this is kind of a pain and probably the most serious con in my opinion. I can have both things connected, but I'm gonna have to do some awkward menu or remote gymnastics in this type of scenario. You see, in my office, I watch TV, I play Xbox, and I listen to music. If all other sources are powered down, the Cyan knows which signal to take and works as it should. But all bets are off if you've got your other stuff on as well. So yeah, well, the Cyan 2 has what they call auto input selection. If you have multiple sources turned on while connected, even if they're not playing sound, they still may lock up the DAC in an unwanted input. Now, because you have no way to physically switch inputs on this DAC, you're either going to need to have everything else turned off or come up with a different trick. Don't worry, I got you covered. First, I figured out a solution involving an optical switcher that comes with this little handy remote control. So now I'm able to just turn that switcher box off with said remote, and then the Cyan won't receive any signal from my TV whatsoever. As for the Weem Pro, I can have that hooked up to a smart switch. I've got a Philips Hue variant and it worked perfectly. Now, my DDC feeding I2S into the Cyan also needed a smart switch, but since I didn't have any extras lying around, I used a cheap outdoor Christmas light plug, and I had a remote for that. I think I got it off of Amazon, and again, it worked flawlessly. All right, one last trick I recently discovered involves connecting an optical cable from the TV to the Weem Pro's optical input. Then using another optical cable from the Weem Pro's output right to the Cyan. Now, what you're going to want to do is you go to the audio input section of your Weem Pro's app and turn on something called Auto Sensing Optical In. Now, this somehow manages switching between both sources completely flawlessly with no remote control, I might add. That was pretty cool. So as it now stands, I've got 3 remotes on my side table, and while that isn't ideal, it does work. I get that the Cyan probably wasn't meant to be used this way, but its sound quality being what it is makes me want to have everything and its brother connected. Remotes are honestly so underrated. Not that this is the only DAC without a remote. I mean, my Denafrips Venus 2, while having buttons to switch inputs, lacks a remote control as well. Same as my Cord Mojo 2. I mean, I'm such a lazy bastard, honestly. Fortunately, Holo's higher end offerings have a remote control, and can I say, yes, please.
Now, the next day I felt like some electronics, so I set up Rune Radio, which eventually came across Spectre. The entire album was such a good listen, and my KEF R3 metas sounded as if they had leveled up. In my opinion, Silicon would be the best karate training montage track like ever. Despite being R2R, this DAC is really fast and well suited for electronic music. Drum hits towards the end of Futetsu no Teo are so naturally vivid, and keep in mind, I don't have a sub running. This DAC is almost microscopic in detail retrieval, but I'm not getting ear fatigue the way I would on a well-measuring Delta Sigma DAC, like my Gustard X16 that lives in a drawer. Alright, so at this point, my Apple Watch gave me a nudge to stand up and walk around. I noticed I hadn't gotten up out of my lazy boy for over an hour and a half. It was then I realized what a positive impact that the Cyan 2 had with my gear. I had intended on ABing that day, but totally got sucked into the experience. And that didn't stop in the days that followed. It was actually not so easy for me to bite the bullet and start ABing. Testing the Cyan 2 for watching TV and playing Xbox was unsurprisingly very positive. No lip syncing issues whatsoever. Timing, detail, soundstage, and even footsteps in Apex Legends were all where you would really want them to be, even for a competitive gamer, which I am not.
So we gotta have a talk about DSD because I feel this is actually a big draw on why you may want a DAC like the Cyan 2. Since it's not possible to process DSD files over an R2R network, the Cyan has a totally separate vector step resistor network that enables it to process pure DSD without any conversions whatsoever. Now, if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that I just stream everything and I don't rely on physical media or pay for downloaded music files. So I've actually never had any experience with the ultra high-res stuff. But in order to experience this DAC and tell you guys what I really think, I decided to just suck it up and just buy some DSD. So I ended up purchasing Thriller from hdtracks.com. Once I configured Rune to play those files properly on the Cyan, I spun up Wannabe Startin' Something. Now, let's just say the level of detail I got was really impressive. Also, this was using USB directly from my Mac Mini. Now, thanks to Cyan's USB port having galvanic isolation, the source was squeaky clean to my ears. Between these local DSD files and Cyan's USB implementation, let's just say I'm really impressed. Imaging was crazy good, and I kept finding myself just turning up the volume a little more and dropping my jaw. And this was before Billie Jean came on. So I picked that album because I know it really well, I've heard it a ton, and on that particular trip, I felt like I had reached a new plateau. Simply put, DSD is legit.
I had my GSX Mini headphone amp hooked up to the Cyan 2 at the same time as the Hegel H190. You see, on some other DACs like my Venus 2, this is not recommended, but with the Cyan outputting to XLR and RCA simultaneously is really no problem at all. While sitting at my desk, there was really no need to rely on Rune's app to check the bitrate. The DAC was much closer, so I could clearly read that fine white print by the corresponding lights. I feel like a lot of you will end up using the Cyan 2 this way, and you'll definitely be pleased in this regard. So overall, I had a great time with my Meze Empyreans and found the Cyan 2 pairing really well with my headphone rig. I couldn't help but take the cans off though once Rune started spitting out some old school Chemical Brothers. The gravitas of my loudspeaker setup with this DAC and electronic music in particular is just huge.
So let's compare the Cyan 2 versus the Mojo 2 in... Now, the Mojo 2 is the closest external DAC that I have to the Cyan price-wise. And while a totally different beast, and yeah, it's still less expensive, I know it really well and typically like what I get out of its DAC.
Once I figured out volume matching on both DACs, I played a couple of tracks that I'm really familiar with. Throughout my testing, I noticed a sort of richness in Cyan's mid-range that wasn't as present with the Mojo. In Dreams, I noticed soundstage was a bit wider on the Cyan, and the music seemed more forward on the Mojo. Differences were really subtle here though, and both DACs honestly did a great job. When I A-B'd with electronic music, I felt the Cyan pulling ahead. This combo just excels with synth or electronic tracks. There is a sense of slam I get, but not at all sloppy. It just sounds amazing. Overall, I'm actually picking the Cyan 2 over the Mojo 2 for sound quality. It was an interestingly close fight, but the Cyan edges it out in soundstage, dynamics, and feels more natural. Obviously, the Mojo is more versatile in the ways that it could be used, but we're just speaking about sound quality, and for that, the Cyan gets it.
How does the Cyan 2 pair with higher-end gear? So I hooked it up to Hagel H390 and Klipsch Cornwall 4s in my main listening room downstairs. I played a bunch of Elvis, and each song became more and more enjoyable as the DAC warmed up.
So after deciding that the Cyan 2 was then optimal, I felt like tripping out to some Animal Collective. Around 9 minutes into this track where it begins to ramp up, I was treated to tight and fast bass. This is definitely an R2R DAC, make no mistake. Highs are a bit rolled off while maintaining a nice resolution, something, as I mentioned earlier, that Delta Sigma DACs just don't seem to do as well. Stage seemed to be both wider and deeper than my other setup, but there's no surprise there with the Cornwall 4s. I know some of you are going to ask how this compares with my Venus 2. I did conveniently have it connected as well, so I briefly went back and forth to do this. The Venus outperformed it. But remember, this is both a different and much more expensive beast. The Venus 2 has more of a bite in its highs, and that's not in a bad way. It just sounds less rolled off and more engaging with my specific system. It also seems to consistently stage wider and renders instruments with a more spacious presentation. It's almost 4 times the price, so yeah, of course that tracks. Until I listen to electronic music and everything I just said somehow goes out the window.
There's something about this DAC in electronic music. Maybe it's because it's true non-oversampling. I don't know, but I love it with this type of music. It just feels faster, as if it's got less bloat between notes. It's a wonderfully dynamic and punchy experience, and it's just really fun to my ears. But again, these two DACs are so different, and the reason that I compared them was because I'm just trying to understand what the Cyan 2 does and where it fits in. Perhaps it would be more of a fair comparison to use something like HQ Player to convert the Cyan 2 to oversampling, but that's just like a whole other can of worms that I'll wade through in another video. Maybe. For now at least, I see the Cyan 2 as a different flavor, one that I'm definitely enjoying much more than any DS DAC that I've ever experienced. It's definitely an R2R, make no mistake, but for me, it's a different experience compared to the R2R DACs that I'm used to, and that's really cool. And with that, let's do some pros and cons. Now that I've had the Cyan 2 for a while, I better understand what Holo is doing with this thing. Analogy time. Here's a story of my first nice German car. So I walked into a BMW dealership and checked out their base rear-wheel drive F30. Now, this was their new 3 Series at the time. I went for a test drive with a salesman, and this guy certainly knew what he was doing. So after a while of putting around, the salesman says to me, okay, now I want you to floor it down this street and then do a sharp turn around the bend. I was like, sure. I did, and holy balls, that was fun. Next, the salesman tells me, slam on the brakes. Okay. Neurons were just popping in my brain, and adrenaline was obviously rushing too. To be honest, I felt like a kid driving a go-kart for the first time ever, and to this day, I frickin' cherish that moment. I knew back then, without hesitation, that this was the car for me. The way it handled, the experience it gave me, this was a fun rocket, and I had to have it. The price was actually surprisingly very doable too. I mean, compared with the Japanese cars that I cross-shopped with earlier. When it came time to ordering, they had so many options and things I just wanted. As I spec'd it out, you guys know how this goes. That base price just kept going up. I mean, you need back seats to fold down for more trunk space. That's more money. You want X-Drive for those rough Toronto winters? More money. Suddenly, that base 320i turned into a much less affordable 328X. And now why not upgrade those stock 17-inch wheels to larger ones that just look much better, along with nice bolstered seats that you could only get in the sports line package. But to be honest, none of this stuff really made as big of an impact as how that base 320i drove. The Cyan 2 is that same first go-kart ride. It gets your foot in the door to an amazing R2R experience the same way that the 320i gave me a delicious taste of what fine German engineering was. You get that pure analog sound that you didn't know you needed until you heard it. But the difference here is you're unable to spec out those extras should you want them. If you want more, you're going to have to shell out and look at Holo Audio's higher-end models. And I totally want to. How does the Spring 3 compare, and how about the May? After my trip with the Cyan 2, make no mistake, I'm down for that test drive. With that, the Holo Audio Cyan 2 comes fully recommended from this channel as long as it fits your use case. It is a bare-bones R2R fun machine, and I think it's going to make a lot of you give up chip DACs for good. I'd like to thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you soon. And as you're about to find out, this DAC punches way above the price of this price. Hadouken!
Yeah, you gotta hold the camera.
It just punches through the price of the punching bag. The price.
Slam on the brakes.
You bite the ear off that price. Like Mike Tyson when he did that to Evander Holyfield. Like bit his ear.
BMW!
Toruden!
Are you not taking me seriously?
Look at the orange.